I'll never forget the night that changed how I look at this job forever. And I've been a nurse long enough to have seen just about everything. But this one stuck with me in a way I can't shake. I was on a night shift in the emergency department. The kind of shift where the air feels heavy and the lights feel just a little too harsh, and you know something is going to test you before you even get a report. We had a man brought in by the police around midnight, disheveled, wild-eyed, and clearly agitated. They'd found him wandering the street, yelling at strangers, covered in cuts and bruises, refusing care until he nearly collapsed on the sidewalk. He didn't want to be there. He made that clear the second they wheeled him in, and his voice carried down the hall before I even saw his face. He was shouting that we were going to kill him, that we were all part of some scheme, his paranoia thick and suffocating, and the officers looked relieved just to pass him off to us. I took report, trying to keep calm, but the way he glared at each of us like we were monsters made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We had to get him assessed, stitched up, hydrated, and medicated for his agitation, but he wasn't having any of it. Every time I came near him with an IV or blood pressure cuff, he swatted it away and snarled threats, his voice breaking between desperation and rage. I'd dealt with combative patients before, but there was a different energy about him, like a storm waiting to break, and I could feel it building with every minute he was in that room. I remember standing outside his door, charting on the computer, when I heard a sudden crash. I spun around and saw that he had managed to rip the IV pole from the wall mount and was holding it like a weapon, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face. Another nurse had just stepped inside with me, and the look of sheer panic in her eyes when she realized what was happening told me we were in real trouble. He started swinging the pole, shouting that he wasn't going to let us poison him, that we'd already killed his brother, and before anyone could react, he lunged toward us. Instinct kicked in. Not training, not policy, just raw instinct, and I grabbed the arm of the other nurse and shoved her toward the hallway as the pole slammed against the wall where she'd been standing. The sound of metal on plaster echoed through the department, and suddenly every other patient and staff member knew something violent was unfolding. Security was called immediately, but those seconds before help arrived stretched on forever. He turned on me next, eyes blazing, cornering me by the counter where we kept supplies, and all I could think was that if he landed one good hit, I'd be going down hard. I tried to keep my voice steady, telling him we just wanted to help, that no one was going to hurt him, but reason didn't stand a chance against his paranoia. He swung again, and this time I blocked with a supply cart, the crash scattering bandages and syringes across the floor, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might faint. Adrenaline kept me moving though, dodging, trying to keep his attention long enough for security to arrive. Finally, 2 security officers burst in, followed by another nurse with a syringe of emergency sedative. The room turned into chaos. The patient swung wildly, catching one of the officers on the shoulder, sending him stumbling back, while the other officer wrestled for control of the pole. I darted in to push the cart aside and yelled to the nurse with the syringe, "Now!" She moved like lightning, managing to jab his arm in the middle of the struggle. But even after the medications started working, he fought like someone possessed, thrashing and screaming until his body finally gave in to the sedative. The pole clattered to the ground, officers panting, my hands shaking so badly I could barely pick up the scattered supplies. The silence afterward felt deafening, like the entire department was holding its breath. And only when I saw my colleague leaning against the doorway with tears in her eyes did I realize just how close we'd come to someone being seriously injured, or worse. We checked the officers, one bruised but otherwise fine, and we checked ourselves, scraped and shaken but intact. The patient, sedated and restrained, was finally safe enough for us to treat. As the adrenaline drained, exhaustion hit me like a wall, and I remember sitting at the nurse's station, staring at my trembling hands, realizing I'd just lived through something that would replay in my mind for a long time. We face people at their most vulnerable and their most dangerous, and sometimes both at once, and there's no predicting how fast it can turn. I kept thinking of what might have happened if I hadn't shoved that other nurse out of the way, if the officers hadn't arrived when they did, if the medication hadn't worked fast enough. Those what-ifs still crawl into my mind whenever I hear a crash or a raised voice in the ER, and they make me more alert, more cautious, maybe even a little hardened. But they also remind me that no matter how terrifying it gets, we step up, we protect each other, and we keep fighting to provide care, even when it feels like we're the ones under attack. I'll never forget the night I had to physically fight for my safety and for my patient's safety. We talk about therapeutic communication, de-escalation techniques, emergency procedures, but no one really prepares you for what it feels like to be locked in a room with someone who's stronger than you, unpredictable, and absolutely determined to lash out. It was one of those late evening shifts on the psychiatric floor, a place where we often see patients in the deepest throes of crisis. I'd been working that unit for a couple of years and thought I had seen the extremes. Violent outbursts, self-harm attempts, staff being spat on or threatened. But this night tested every ounce of courage I had. The patient was a man in his early 30s, admitted after a series of violent episodes at home. He had a history of psychosis mixed with substance abuse, which made his mood volatile and his body restless with a kind of strength that comes out of sheer rage and adrenaline. He came in guarded, glaring at everyone, pacing his room like a caged animal, muttering under his breath. I kept an eye on him but told myself I could handle him if things escalated. I'd handled worse, or so I thought. At first, things seemed tense but manageable. I tried approaching him gently with medication, speaking calmly, reminding him he was in a safe place, but he snapped at me with such venom in his voice that I felt a chill run through my bones. He said he knew what we were doing to him, that we were poisoning him, that I wasn't a nurse at all but part of some plot to silence him. The paranoia was thick in his words, and his hands clenched into fists every time I spoke. I stepped back, reminding myself to keep space between us. But then another patient on the unit started yelling down the hall, and he took that as his cue to completely unravel. He shoved his chair across the room, the metal legs scraping so loud it echoed down the hall. And before I knew it, he charged straight at me. My training said to call for backup, but I didn't even have a chance to hit the emergency button before he was on me. His hand grabbed the front of my scrub top and slammed me back against the wall so hard my head rattled. I remember the raw strength of his grip, how his eyes looked wild and glassy, and for one terrifying second I thought he was going to crush my throat right there. Adrenaline surged, and survival instincts I didn't even know I had kicked in. I twisted my body sideways, trying to break his grip, and shouted as loud as I could for help, hoping someone down the hall would hear me. He tried to punch me then, a full swing with his free hand, but I ducked just in time and his fist smashed into the wall, leaving a crack in the plaster. That gave me the opening I needed to shove him back just enough to scramble toward the door, but he lunged again and grabbed my arm, twisting it so hard I thought it might break. The pain shot up my shoulder, but somehow I managed to wrench myself free, pushing back with all my weight. We ended up in a full-on struggle. My body pressed against his as I tried to keep him from pinning me to the ground. I kept thinking, this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't supposed to happen. But in the same breath, I knew I couldn't let him get the upper hand. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a clipboard that had fallen off the counter, and used it to block his next swing. It shattered in my hands, papers flying everywhere, but it gave me just enough leverage to shove him back again. By then, 2 other nurses and a security officer burst into the room, but he was far from done. He spun away from me and lunged at them, fists swinging, roaring like he had superhuman strength. It took all 3 of them to hold him down, and even then he thrashed so violently that they could barely restrain him. I jumped in to help, grabbing his legs as he kicked wildly, all of us working in unison just to keep him from hurting himself or anyone else. We finally managed to get him onto the ground and strapped into the emergency restraints, sweat dripping from our foreheads. arms aching from the sheer physical fight it took to control him. The security officer called for immediate sedation, and another nurse came rushing in with a syringe. Even as the medication entered his system, he fought with every ounce of his strength, but eventually his body slowed, his muscles slackened, and he lay there breathing heavily, restrained but alive. When it was finally over, I stumbled back against the wall, my chest heaving, my arm throbbing from where he'd twisted it. The room was a wreck, papers scattered, furniture overturned, my uniform torn at the collar. I remember looking down at my shaking hands and realizing that if help hadn't arrived when it did, I might not have walked out of that room at all. My colleagues looked just as shaken, one nurse crying quietly in the corner, the security officer holding his bruised arm. We all knew we had just gone through one of the worst-case scenarios we trained for, but hope never actually happens. The aftermath was surreal. We filed the incident report, checked each other for injuries, and then somehow we just kept working, because the floor doesn't stop just because you've been attacked. Other patients still needed meds, vital signs still needed to be taken, charts still needed updating. I went through the motions, but inside I was trembling. Hours later, when my shift finally ended, I sat alone in my car, replaying the moment he grabbed my shirt, the way his fist missed my face by inches, the sound of plaster cracking. I thought about how close I came to being seriously injured, and how easily the outcome could have been different.